Hi everyone, so last night we had a Season 9 campfire chat. I made a video about that already, summarizing all the new stuff. You can go check that out if you haven't seen it. But now we also have the patch notes, and oh boy, there's a lot of nerfs in there. It's effectively all nerfs, and all of the new stuff does not really look that enticing either. So it's going to be quite interesting the way this is going to work. So what you need to know is that, yeah, they did buff some stuff like basic builds, and people were talking about like Stormclaw Druid coming back. But I mean, you have to see that Stormclaw Druid is so far down that it's not even listed at this point. And a little buff like a ×2 or ×3 is not gonna save that. Like these builds here are literally like 1,000 times weaker compared to this. Like you're not gonna see a Stormclaw Druid. And also like some of the other stuff they tease, like, you know, basic skill barb with the new unique or something like that, is not really happening, I think. So there needs to be a lot more work. And now what some of those buffs do, for example, the basic buffs that we see here, like every class got some of those updates, for example, everything is higher. Yeah, it's gonna be kind of cool in the early game, like when you're level 30 or so, but it's not really going to change much in terms of like late game builds. We have some existing basic builds, like, you know, Bash Barb and so on, but yeah, it's so far down right now that maybe with like all the nerfs that happen to like the overpower builds, for example, like, you know, literally all of these here are just going down like -70% or something. Yeah, maybe that's gonna kind of average out, but realistically, they're gonna remain bad builds, I think. And so there might be some outliers that kind of work right now, like Heartseeker, Invigorating Strike. Like, yeah, these things currently, for example, don't rely on overpower, and they are actually getting a bit of a bump. So we'll see that, but yeah, they are also just kind of like mid-range builds. So the question is, what is actually going to remain? I hope you're enjoying the video so far, but before we continue, I want to give a shout out to today's sponsor, Sirocco. This is a game that I had a ton of fun playing lately on stream, and also want to show it to you guys. This is a MOBA inspired by the old Warcraft 3 custom map battleships made into a game, basically. So if you know Dota or LoL, this is a very similar game, but I have to say much easier to get into, and it's with ships. I played a lot of MOBAs back in the day, and I gotta say this was really a breath of fresh air jumping into Sirocco with that old school nostalgia. This game offers a lot of customization in your playstyle. There are different ships, different captains with different perks, different weapon types, and overall there's a lot of strategy and really cool stuff you can try to build, especially if you queue up with your teammates. And the best part, this game is fully free to play. You can find the download link down in the description and in the pinned comment. So I hope you enjoyed this. I had a ton of fun with this, but let's go back to the video. Well, since overpower got nerfed so much, basically everything all the way down to here or something is going way down. The exception here really is like Earthquake. So here's Earthquake, here's Earthquake, here's Earthquake. So those builds will remain really strong. In fact, right now I think that generally the Earthquake builds are going to be the best overall on the Barb and across all classes. We do have some of builds that are really powerful right now, like, you know, the Necros here. They do have heavy nerfs coming for them. But on the other hand, they are so far above the rest right now that they will probably remain somewhere in like the pit 100+ range, similar to this here. And then you have a lot of builds that will just like go down thanks to overpower nerfs, so like -80% or something like that. And yeah, we'll see exactly how this will play out. There's also some extra nerfs that happen to some of those builds. For example, Enlightenment is getting fixed / nerfed. So basically a lot of the Sorc builds will go down a lot. This also includes like combustion builds, like we had like this bug lately in Season 8 where combustion just randomly gave you like a times 10,000% multiplier or something like that. That is now going to be a times 100%. Yeah, so these combustion builds are basically dead. And this doesn't really leave us with all that much stuff that's going on. So it is definitely a huge shakeup here on like the top end of builds. All of the stuff is going down, with like Earthquakes losing the least, I would say. And we'll see exactly where this will play out. But the thing is that not just the top builds got nerfed, but, you know, there's a lot of blanket nerfs across the board because we have lots of new caps for key passes, for example. If you take a look at, let's say, close quarters combat for the rogues, people currently stack that to like a times 250 or so multiplier, and that is now capped at 90, and they're probably not even going to reach that because they reduced the scaling. So it's going to lose like half the damage from that, for example, in addition to the overpower nerfs, in addition to the Ice in the Dark nerf. So something like Death Trap is going to go down like -90% or so. And there's similar examples where you have like kind of like other builds caught in a crossfire. You know, there's like Rain of Arrows Rogue. Precision is getting a heavy nerf that's only gonna do like maybe half or maybe a third of the damage it did before. And there's also other stuff, like basically everything Poison Imbuement is like completely dead now on rogues. And this is like a similar picture on many other classes, where some of the key passes got capped, or they changed some of the like overall scaling of the game, thanks to overpower, for example. And you know, like all this stuff here on Bard, everything that's overpower based right now is just gone, basically. So this is like, you know, archive territory, basically, and the same applies to like some of the other builds. Now, obviously, we're still gonna have some good builds next season, and it's really hard to say exactly which those will be before we play the PTR. We might find some stuff, we might find some bugs, and so on. But the overarching picture definitely shows that, yeah, everything is going down. The current S tier does not exist anymore. Like, we're probably gonna have to like rescale the entire tier list to the point where we have like a certain, you know, pit clear numbers, for example, here, and that will just have to come down as like the top level of the clears that we can see. And we're gonna have like a new S tier, but everything is gonna be just lower than before, basically. Interestingly, the Spiritborn actually didn't really get a lot of nerfs here. So for example, Quivolley kind of got out of this whole situation pretty well. It does also suffer from like overpower nerfs, but there were like no bug fixes to some double dipping that we can see with the Jaguar Hall, for example. And overall, basically no updates to the class at all. They did buff like Razor Wings, but that is like a completely irrelevant buff that will not really change anything about its placement, I think. And overall, Spiritborn might actually be one of the better classes, maybe the best class even, next patch, thanks to the lack of like bug fixes and just a lack of nerfs. They didn't actually nerf much. There is like a nerf to the Noxious Resonance key passive, so the poison builds especially will suffer a little bit, but they also get this infinite scaling, new Heraldic Jewel. There's like some dot power that is a bit like Bane of the Stricken from Diablo 3, where you get like infinite extra damage at some point, and this might actually be kind of a redeeming factor depending on how exactly it works and how fast you can stack it. So it seems like Spiritborn is kind of back in action. Something like Evade is going to be very good. I think it's going to be one of the top builds actually this season again, even though it's like really ranked far down here because it doesn't push that high. With the nerfs that we see to all the other classes, this is probably going to become the best speed farming build again, similar to like Season 6 or like early Season 6 at least, where that was played by a lot of people. So I think that is going to make a huge comeback here. It was already pretty good when I played it back in Season 8 now, and but it doesn't lose anything actually, so it's still there basically, and it's blasting. So that is actually a good enough build, and will be one of the best farmers out there. Then we also have the Druids. Druids are kind of an interesting spot in the way that currently extremely well balanced, and Cataclysm is about to get a heavy nerf, so we're also talking about like a 90% or so nerf. So that is also kind of going to come down like somewhere in this range here probably, and kind of like joining the other Druid builds up here. And well, we have actually, you know, kind of like overall balanced meta, but there is also this overall like overpower nerf, so that will also shake it up a little bit here, because not every Druid build is based on overpower. So for example, Companion Druid is relatively high up here and not an overpower build. So this might actually kind of end up being the strongest build now or so. So it's going to be interesting to see. And there's a bunch of other stuff, like something like Shred, for example, or so, that is like not really overpower based. And we'll see. But there might be like some builds like that that kind of didn't really get affected by anything, and that might suddenly start shining here. In general, everything like minion related didn't really see much of a nerf. So for example, minion necro, I also expect that to be very good. And even like the minion barb, there was no mention of fixing the bug where you can have more than 12 ancients out. They're supposed to be capped at 12, and right now you can just have infinite of those basically. So that is going to be still a good build, I assume. And yeah, we're gonna see a lot of like minion meta basically, but I don't really have that much hope in the new Skedaddle Mage Necro stuff. It's mostly gonna be like the existing minion setup, I think. And then if you go a little bit further down here, we do have a lot of like these like, you know, crossover like nerfs from, you know, for example, enlightenment nerfs. So a lot of builds here right now on the Sorc are using all this like enlightenment giga bug stacking tech that just makes them way better than they usually are. And we already see stuff like Blizzard Sword, for example, way down here, and that's just gonna go even further down when they lose like a, you know, ×10 multi or something like that. So overall, I do have to say it's good that Blizzard is kind of cracking down on all of this like overpowered stuff, but on the other hand, it is gonna basically kill a lot of builds without any compensatory buffs. So while in current Season 8, we already had this difficulty increase with Torment 4 being way harder, Torment 4 bosses being very hard for some builds, that is about to get even worse in many cases, and I think a lot of builds here will actually struggle in Torment 4, or at the very least with Torment 4 bosses. So right now you can, you know, take probably the top 50 builds or something, and you're kind of fine when it comes to T4 and T4 bossing, and then, you know, speed farming pits, you know, 60 plus, let's say, depending on how good the build is. But yeah, like a lot of builds will go down somewhere in the range of 10 pit tiers, I guess. And some of the like top builds will go down way more than that, like 20 tiers. Something like Lightning Spear, you know, without the overpower bug, without the enlightenment bug, with the nerf to Lightning Spear, like that build is going down like 30 tiers or something like that. So some of those get nerfed quite a lot. And 30 tiers, we're talking about something like an around times 1,000 multiplier or so. Now, interestingly, especially on the topic of Lightning Spear, despite it going so far down, it will probably remain one of the like better endgame builds anyway, because they didn't actually change the mechanics of the skill. So I was hoping they would do some adjustment where, yeah, they bring down the damage a little bit and fix the bugs, but more importantly, they would reduce the AoE potential of it, because right now it arcs to 5 extra enemies. And this also leads to the scenario where you just have like negative boss damage, because yeah, you're vibing when there's many targets, you're one-shotting everything around you, and then there's one target and you don't get any arcs and you just don't have any boss damage. So I think it would have been a much smarter solution to actually reduce the number of arcs to maybe just 1 extra arc, so here's like 2 targets instead of 6 targets, and this would naturally just feel a lot better, where, you know, the AoE clear is lower, but the single target is better in comparison. And then, of course, bring down the damage of the build a little bit anyway. But the way that it's nerfed now is just, okay, it's way harder to get online, to the point where you just blast everything in Torment 4, but you will get there, and then it will just be like the best build again, basically, when it comes to like, you know, T4 farming. It's gonna one-shot everything around it in like a 5 screens radius, and so on. So we will get there, I think. It's just gonna be way harder to get to that point. And obviously, you're not gonna farm that high in the pit. You're not gonna push that high in the pit with it anymore. You also have a bunch of new items here. I showed them off briefly last night, and after thinking about this a little bit more, I do have to say that all of these new items just seem somewhat underwhelming. So we got one for each class. The only one that kind of stands out here is the Hydra Amulet for the Sorc. So that could be potentially like a new meta build, and I think something that a lot of people might be looking forward to. So I think there is some potential here, but we do have to remember that Hydra starts at a very low point. So we'll see if that is enough. I didn't really do the math on this just yet, and this is something that I will try out on Tuesday whenever the PTR goes live, so as soon as possible. I think this could be very cool. I think a lot of people are looking forward to this, and if this is like somewhat well balanced, this could be like a nice extra addition. But all the other stuff is just kind of whatever. We have these basic attack boots here for the barbs, but the basic attacks are starting at a very weak point. Yeah, they are getting some buffs, but as I explained earlier, it's not really enough to really make a dent with like the power gaps that we have right now in the builds. And also they are nerfing some of the basic build buffs, like Moonrise Aspect. And well, adaptability might be a nerf for some builds, but a buff for other builds. That depends a little bit on how much maximum resource you have. But there's like some other small things like that, basically. Shard of Erathiel is also going down. So I don't really expect that much from the basic attack barbs. People are talking about Frenzy Barb and so on. Yeah, maybe. But realistically, I guess you're going to see Bash again, maybe. And then Frenzy as some kind of like worse meme version of that. And that's about it. So I think this needs a lot more than just those boots. Then we have the Druid here with the Rotting Lightbringer. I do like the idea of a pulverized meta and a pulverized buff and a big chonker weapon, but this is not really chonking just yet. It's a two-handed weapon, which is a massive slot to give up for the Druids. So this needs really big numbers. And I am very concerned about this Poison Puddle just doing nothing, basically, because this is a build that scales off crits and overpowers. And I kind of doubt that any of those two things actually goes into this poison shenanigans here. So this needs some form of scaling with those mechanics that Pulverize normally has. So like an idea that I gave to this was, for example, maybe this poison pool could be like some like pseudo enemy target that you hit, and then the pool scales of the damage that you would deal to that pool, for example. So they can actually scale all of your damage into the explosions. So something like that maybe could solve that problem here, and then maybe buff the numbers a little bit, because right now it is not really enough, even with that, I think. But it is a cool concept at least. So I hope that we're gonna see some Polarize action here. But keep in mind, Polarize is an overpower build. Overpower builds are going down, and Polarize is actually currently, I think, the weakest, or almost the weakest on the Druid right now. So this needs to be a big weapon if this is supposed to make a comeback. And then we have the Necromancer with the Skeletal Mage glove here. So it's just like another form of playing minions. Minion Necro right now is really good. So I'm not 100% sure how this will play into it. But I guess, you know, either you play normal minions as always, or maybe we do this stuff here and it might be somewhere in a similar range. It is definitely like a cool alternative. So if the balance checks out, minion necros I expect to be quite good, so we'll see about this glove. Then we have the rogues with this helm here, Flurry. Flurry is also just kind of on the like, mid-range of builds, I would say, and this helm is not even that impressive. So I'm not really sure if I even want to use this over something like Perdition Helm, for example. Yeah, it has a 50% attack speed buff, a 50% damage buff, so it's just kind of like, you know, another power-crept helm slot, because we have insane mythics there. But it's not really a huge upgrade over the existing items that we already have. So it's not really gonna make Flurry suddenly very good, and this also needs like a lot more, I think. And also, in fact, I'm not 100% sure if we really want to spend our life here. It's actually relatively easy to solve that life problem, but the other problem is that we don't spend energy, which means we don't get preparation, which means we don't reset our ultimate, and so on, right? So we need to actually have our perma shadow clone some way, and this is usually done through preparation. So this is why I'm not really that confident in this helm here. So it might be used in the final setup, but it's not really like a buff to the build. Then we have the Sorks. I talked about that. I do have hope for this, so we'll see. And then you have the Spiritborn here, and I did do some math on this and try to like include this in some other builds. My TLDR here is it's probably not going to go into any existing like poison, Noxious Resonance builds, because it has like this poison proc here, so that is not happening. It could maybe see play in like existing like Thorns builds like Rock Splitter, but more importantly, I think it might have its own new build that is going to be similar to the Vashan Spiritborn that I've shown off lately, where we just try to scale lots of attack speed and lots of generic damage multis. We can easily fit in the Razor Plate as well. So this is actually something I'm going to try, and that might actually have some real potential here for like a new, maybe even pretty top tier build. So we'll see about that. Aside from that, I can also go through some of the other class changes here. So let's just go through this real quick. So we talked about the basic buffs. Every class got like some basic skill buffs, but basically most of them are also relatively little impactful in the late game thanks to the other basic attack nerfs, and it's not really going to be a massive change here. The Hunter nerf, they talked about this extensively on the campfire chat. This is literally irrelevant, so don't worry. Hunter needs to be nerfed in other ways. For example, the maximum ferocity needs to go, and maybe the damage against injured. Now obviously every build profits from that right now, so there needs to be some kind of compensatory buff if they do this, but this is the only way I see it to actually bring the Hunter into like balanced territory, and then they still have to buff the other ultimates a lot in order to make them playable. But I think Hunter should be some form of like, you know, speed farming choice, where you have to jump and you have the ferocity generation, and you know, it has some other perks. That's about it. And this extra maximum ferocity is just way too much, basically. Noxious Resonance, it is a massive nerf. So for example, a Stinger build that I have on max roll has like a 1500% increase to the Noxious Resonance proc. So instead of 100% damage, it does like, you know, 1600%. And now it's going to do 180%. So it's a nerf of like 85% or something here. But it does also open up some extra choices. You get 2 glyphs, you get a bunch of extra additive damage. You're gonna get back probably something like a ×3 or something like that. So I think the overall net loss is like half the damage, which is kind of a bummer. But it also means we have like a bit better distribution between single target and AoE damage, which is something I've been asking for. The single target on the poison Spiritborn builds just always feels awful. You just always hit like a brick wall at the boss, because you don't have these like 20% pops here. They're actually really important to make those damage bursts feel good. And now there's a bit more power in the single target compared to here, which is a good thing, but overall they are nerfed. The only redeeming factor that we have here maybe is this infinitely stacking mechanic from one of the season powers, and depending on how that works, that could be pretty nuts. So I'm holding my breath here. This does nothing. This also does next to nothing. The Razor Wing buff is also completely irrelevant. Like, this is not going to help the build at all. I would hope to see like some real, like, ranged playstyle, and not like a scuffed Hammerden with the spirals and then you have like this random counter attack deflection here. I think this is just kind of a bad mechanic. It's very inconsistent. It doesn't feel that fun. I think we need like a real ranged build here. Like, I want to throw those discs at range and then, do maybe damage depending on how far away I am or something like that. Or maybe like multiple hits where, I can like try to like hit them on the way out and on the way back. Or like there's like the spinning thing where they slow down and then maybe deal damage multiple times in a spot or something like that. So this is what I would like to see. And Razor Wings with this is like not anywhere close. Sabazontek, slight nerf, but that's okay because we get buffs. But this is actually going to affect Rock Splitter. So Rock Splitter is currently not benefiting from any of the basic buffs here. So this, for example, does absolutely nothing to Rock Splitter because it's a Thorns build and all the damage comes from the Thorns. So there is a bit of potential with the new pants. But on the other hand, yeah, it's not even going to make up for the loss, basically, of stuff like Sabazontek and Moonrise and so on. So right now, Rock Splitter is actually going down. And we'll see what will come out of this. There's a bunch of like little Paragon buffs here, which is nice. So this is playable now, I would say. This is also playable now, I would say. So that both these things are nice. This change is irrelevant. And yeah, so this is basically it for the Spiritborn here. Now let's talk about the base game updates here. So this is all the other classes. Let's go class by class. We start here. So there's again a bunch of nerfs. Shard of Erathiel. Then we have Pain Gorgeous. I mean, this nerf doesn't do anything. Pain Gorgeous effect is completely pointless right now. So this is actually useless. But here's like a slight nerf to basic attacks. Here's a slight nerf to basic attacks. Here's like a nerf or a buff depending on the build. So for example, for some Barb builds, this might actually be an improvement. Or for example, this might now go into the Kepeleke builds on the Spiritborn as a replacement to Moonrise, for example. So this is probably a thing. Then we have, a bunch of these basic buffs again. And now let's talk about the classes. So we have the Barb here, a bunch of basic buffs again. But again, like, I don't really expect that much from that. And a few other changes here. More notably, they have changed a lot of legendary Paragon nodes here to just kind of like be a bit more consistent. So you don't have to stack anything. It doesn't actually really affect anything because you easily max those out, like, Hemorrhage, for example, Blood Rage as well. Like, this was not a problem at all for anything. I don't really understand why this was changed. So now you just get a 45% multi, I guess, and you just get a 45 multi here and so on. It's a bit conditional because here I need to bleed and so on. But on the other hand, they also didn't really buff the legendary Paragon nodes that were in need of buffing, like Carnage, effectively got a nerf, and it was always like the weakest. So this was a 16% damage buff, now it's a 15, but it doesn't have to be stacked anymore. But realistically, I mean, 15% additive attack speed is like nothing, especially if compared to something like this here. So here's a 45% multi, and there's a 15% additive attack speed buff. So, this one is like literally 4 times better than the attack speed or so in terms of the value overall to your build. So that's a bit confusing, I have to say, especially with like the power that some of the Barb builds currently have with like Earthquakes and so on. I think this could have been adjusted more, and maybe this could have been buffed more, but okay. This is effectively like a side grade, I guess. It's more for our power builds only now, and not like, okay, you now get both buffs and so on. So some builds might have to pivot here to something else. Flawless Technique is also similar in like the Carnage. It's just kind of like a joke. You get 15% crit chance instead of 15% attack speed. So again, if you compare this to something like Blood Rage, like this is not in the same universe. And Force of Nature, this is like the Earthquake nerf. We did expect that. And this nerf is just not that crazy. It puts it to like roughly half the damage or so. So we're still gonna see Earthquakes beyond Pit 100, I think. Then we have the Druids here, a bunch of basic buffs again. Especially Earthspike is getting a massive update. And in fact, that might become a build now. So there is an Earthspike aspect that already got some buffs in the past. where you do like a line of earth spikes, and they can also like multi-hit big targets, for example. So together with like some of the other like basic attack stuff, this could be a thing. I hear people talking about Wind Shear, but this buff literally does nothing. This is only for the early game, because the original Wind Shear build from like season 4, for example, that was a dot build based on the Calm Breeze aspect, and the Wind Shear damage didn't affect it at all. So this doesn't matter. Same with Storm Strikes. This is like not anywhere close to enough to bring back something like Storm Strike or make any other like new builds here, so I wouldn't really hold my breath. Pulverize is getting a little bit of a buff here, which is nice. Also like more overpowers, so that is cool. We're getting a bit of a buff here from Debilitating Roar. Grizzly Rage is getting a buff. I do expect Grizzly Rage to be a much more prevalent meta choice compared to before, especially with Cataclysm also going way down. They're nerfing the Mjolnir ring. That is probably mostly dead now for everything outside of Cataclysm, unless you're really desperate for resources. So that is going down like a lot when you go here to the unique thing. Here, this is a 40% damage buff now instead of 100% on the Mjolnir ring. So previously Cataclysm was a very popular choice for many builds, and that is mostly it's going to be a Cataclysm choice now, I think, and they're going to try to solve your resources in other ways. But there is also some kind of like neat little updates here. So for example, we have this here, increased poison damage. So this is a thing for boulders, for example, or with the new Rabid Bear aspect, you can now convert all of your damage to poison while you're in Grizzly Rage. So this is like a free buff that you can pick up here, basically. So it does make up a little bit for some of the like overpower nerfs and so on. So I think overall Dude is going to get out of this whole patch relatively well, even though we do have some heavy nerfs to like the overpower stuff. But there is also like some other nice little buffs here. You get more resources, and you get a bit more damage from a Nature's Fury. They changed the user and strength a little bit to be more werebear focused and less like just pick it up and have extra free damage kind of thing. But I think that's okay. There's nothing that really brings like human druid into the spotlight as well. We had this new helm back in season 8. I tried that a little bit as well with like Tornado, and that was really bad. And there's nothing that really assists it now in the new patch, so I think it's going to be mostly a shape-shifting meta yet again. But yeah, overall it definitely looks like Polarize is shaping up to be something pretty cool. They also added this cooldown reset thing here, so you're going to have a lot of like Bulwark casts now, you're going to have a lot of Petrify casts if you want to include that. So I think this could be pretty fun actually, so I really hope that Polarize is going to pop off, maybe with a bit of a buff to the unique, which right now seems, you know, very sus. But if that is properly balanced, then we could see like some really cool pulverized meta here. And personally, this is like my favorite on Druid, so I'm very excited. Here's the Cataclysm nerf I talked about earlier, so this is the reason why it goes down so much. So in addition to the overpower nerfs, we also have this, which is a combo with the Mjolnir ring. So Mjolnir ring has an effect that makes your Cataclysm scale with your lightning bolt increases. So previously this was like a 400%, 500% damage buff or whatever, and now it's a 40%. So that goes down by like a factor of 3 or so just from that. And then we have the overpower nerfs, so we're talking about like a minus 90% or so. Then we have the Necros here, so again basic buffs. I don't really think that this is gonna go anywhere. There is like a Bone Splinters, a Bone Spirit build where like you shoot out these 20 splinters or something. That could be maybe something, but it's probably just a scuffed version of like a real Bone Spirit build anyway. At least it used to be in the past, and I'm not sure if that's gonna change it. Also a sneaky damage nerf here to Soul Rift. They did talk about Soul Rift no longer granting a barrier, which I think is fine. You can get barriers in other ways. Necros are relatively tanky these days, so this is not a huge problem here. But this is also like a nerf to basically every build that is not Bloodwave already, for example, because they usually all run Soul Rift. So this is just a blanket nerf to the class pretty much, but I think also warranted. I think many builds will probably still run Soul Rift despite no barrier and despite this nerf. So this is how good that skill actually was. So I guess it might be fine. And we also have a bunch of other like nerfs across the board here. Like Affliction is now damage bonus capped, but that was kind of awful already. This is damage bonus capped here. Shadow Blight as well is getting a change. Wrathmans is getting a slight change. So overall, many Necro builds will go down somewhere in a range of probably like 10-15 pit tiers. That includes like the top builds and some mediocre builds. I think maybe one that comes out of this relatively unscathed is like maybe Blight. So that should be okay probably. But outside of that, yeah, okay, we still have Bloodwave, we still have Bone Spirit, and with the bone spear, for example. So those builds are just so powerful in Season 8 right now that they're probably going to be just fine, but they didn't also really do any kind of like mechanical updates. Like it's kind of clunky to play some of those builds. Like Bone Spear requires you to cast a Bone Prison and then reset that Bone Prison, and then you have to cast it again on the next pack and so on. So it's like kind of like a slow, clunky playstyle. And they also didn't really update anything on like the Paragons, for example. So every time I play a Necro, I level to 60 and I open the Paragons for the first time, and then I get reminded, yeah, I really don't want to pick like half of the stuff here. But I have to, right? Stuff like Flesh Eater is very clunky, stuff like Blood Begets Blood is very clunky, and you just have to like shoehorn it in somehow because that's the only stuff you can pick that does anything. So I think that should have been like a focus here for Necros, to just make the class like less clunky and give more options, but this is not what we got. There's also a few of these legendary aspects here that were changed. So for example, Bone Skills now deal shadow damage. It doesn't seem to add like the darkness tag, so it might not even work with like the, you know, darkness passes, for example. Maybe it does, so I guess we'll see, but overall I don't expect that much from this anyway. Same with the Bone Prison Blight stuff here. This seems almost like a wasted slot because, okay, you have to do the Bone Prison. It's, you know, Blight plus Bone Prison. Yeah, the idea is cool, but again, it's like this clunkiness that I just talked about, where you have to do the Bone Prison in order to deal the damage, and if you don't do that, then yeah, it's just not gonna be that strong. So we'll see. Maybe for like a pushing scenario, but not for the farming scenario, this might be okay. Here's like the blighted aspect that was changed, but I don't really have high hopes for that. And also like the Blood Mist aspect got changed a little bit to mobility, and here as well. A bunch of nerfs to existing items here, so Bone Spear again, and then all the blood builds as well. But there is Bloodless Scream, and that is actually kind of interesting item here. So it now gives you a 200% damage to frozen and boss enemies. And then, okay, this part here is irrelevant, so we only focus on the first. And that could be kind of interesting, especially for builds that may want to try to deal damage with multiple sources at once, because this weapon doesn't have any, like, you know, weapon specific, like a skill specific tempers, for example. So it's just a 200% buff almost all the time, and that could be something now. So I guess we'll see. But it may be something like of a downgrade from, or like a side grade for most builds. Then we have the rogues here. Again, some basic buffs. So we do have Heartseeker and we do have Invigorating Strike. So these are actual builds, but they're also not getting buffed by that much. So there's like a ×2. This is like not even that on Invigorating Strike. So overall, together with the nerfs to some of the tools for basic skills, this is not really going to be an upgrade. So they're gonna stay kind of where they are, plus they are nerfing the key passes a lot on the rogue, and they're also nerfing the death trap. So there's several nerfs here to the death trap. For example, the single target is going way down. Previously it had like insane boss damage compared to like every other rogue build. It didn't need to stagger, for example. But you're also getting this perk here, so for pushing this will be noticed a little bit, I guess, because previously this didn't work. So when enemies were unstoppable, you didn't get the extra damage at all, even though you should have. I'm not really sure what this line means, but I don't think it means anything. Then you have the flurry stuff, as I talked about, like the new helm, for example. I don't think it's really gonna make a dent here, so flurry is gonna be okay, and it's probably gonna be not more than that. So we'll see. Here's effectively a nerf to Dance of Knives. Previously, it was able to snapshot this guaranteed crit and vuln effect here, so especially for the early game, that was kind of nice. Late game, it's kind of easy to get permanent crit and permanent vulnerable anyway, so it didn't really affect it, but the leveling is going to come down a little bit, which I think is a good thing. Dance of Knives is quite clearly, by far, the best leveling build in the game currently, and it's probably gonna stay there, even with this change. But this opens up a few other options here, at least for the early game. Later on, again, everyone has 100% crit, so it doesn't matter. What does make an impact though are these key passive nerfs. So we have close quarters, I talked about this, so this is going down from like a ×3, ×3.5 multi to maybe close to ×2. You're not even going to reach that 90% most likely because this scaling was changed, but it is going to remain a relatively good choice for builds that want to, you know, scale just overall damage basically. So it is not a bad choice still. But for example, momentum is going to rise a little bit in terms of use, I think. Momentum only has a 30% damage buff, but it has a very strong aspect that goes with it, the stolen vigor aspect, and that is actually really good. So if you don't have any other strong aspects to put in your build, then momentum might actually be like a really solid choice for most builds, at least until the very late game, when you can actually scale this high enough, because you need to like really invest with tempers and masterworks and so on to get to the point where this is like a high enough value. Position getting a massive nerf, so typical builds are probably in the range of like a 1500 or even 2k damage buff here. That is now capped at 360 bonus. So that's, that is really bad for any like ranged rogue right now. So Rain of Arrows might survive this, but the others, I'm not so sure. I can look at Mixture, it's just completely dead. This is also going from like a 1000% buff to nothing basically, and it was already struggling. And Victimize was not even a thing, and now it's just deleted from the game basically. So Victimize just needs a rework yet again, I think, at some point. This is not happening. Here we have some legendary aspect updates, so this doesn't really matter. Then we have the infiltrators, which I don't think is going to get used at all. It's kind of like a cool concept. I like the idea behind infiltrators, and actually way back in season 0, I remember I made like a build with infiltrators aspect and stealthing around, trying to grind my way to like a tier 100 nightmare dungeon with poison trap, which was kind of funny. It was obviously a bit of a meme, but it kind of worked. And these days, Poison Trap is actually probably one of the best rogue builds now, with the nerfs to Death Trap and with the nerfs to the close quarters and so on. There is actually a Poison Trap setup that is going to be pretty high end for the overall standards of the nerfed meta, basically. So it's going to be exciting to see, but it's not going to run infiltrators, I think. So this change here is realistically not really going to affect anything like in terms of meta builds. Also like this cooldown reduction here, like we just go for permanent poison trap spam already, and we don't really want to rely on the stealth to do that and so on. But it might be a bit of like an early game choice to kind of get the poison trap build online really soon if you want to do that. So as soon as you find this, you can actually try to include some stealth sources, and then you just spam poison traps, and that could actually be relatively strong from like low levels on. But other than that, I don't really see any hope here. Cheats got a bit of a nice update here. Volatile shadows, that is kind of interesting. Shadow imbuement coming back, maybe, but I don't really have high hopes for it, to be honest, because, for example, if you look back at like the old school, like, penetrating shot, shadow imbuement setups, like that was really cool stuff. These days, you kind of have to play like precision, and precision doesn't buff shadow imbuement in any way. It only buffs the pen shot. So this aspect here, even if you imagine something like 25 ranks on your pen shot, is not really going to do much. I tried alchemical at mixture shadow imbuement stuff back when it came out, basically when they made that new key passive in season 6, and that was really awful even in Torment 4, before they buffed everything in Torment 4. So realistically, I don't have any hope here. There is a bit of synergy with something like Shadow Step. There's like a pair of boots that also has like Shadow Imbuement synergy, and that build can actually run close quarters combat, which buffs all of your damage, including this. So maybe something like that could be a thing, but outside of like Shadow Step, I don't really see that much here, to be honest. Then we have the Bursting Venoms aspect. That was changed from giving you infinite poison imbuement to now give you like random poison trap spawns, which is kind of interesting, because the best way to play poison trap might actually be to not press poison trap, but to actually just like spam barrage into a pack of enemies. The typical lucky hit stuff that we have seen with like Andariels or Victimize and so on, and Arrow Storms in the past, for example. So that might actually be a better way to play than actually pressing Poison Trap if you use this aspect here. So we'll see, but I think there's a bit of potential for that. So if you don't really like the idea of like pressing Poison Trap all the time, then this might be an alternative here at least. But in terms of like poison imbuement builds, they mostly relied on bursting enemies, but there are alternatives to getting enough poison imbuement charges anyway, with preparation, cooldown resets, and more poison imbuement charges, for example. For some reason, we have the Dark Dance aspect also mentioned here in the rogue section, which is now mobilitive instead of additive. So that was kind of like a problem in the past. So I guess I checked that out because of the flurry changes, which is a relatively nice aspect. It's an 80% multi and 120 even on the neck, or 160 on a two-handed. So it's pretty strong for something like flurry that can now deliberately spend life whenever you want, but it's also not really going to make like a huge dent in your overall performance, I think, because there are plenty of really good aspects here. Then we have Eagle Horn. Yeah, I mean, pen shot is not really looking great, and with or without Eagle Horn, that doesn't really matter. And to be honest, this like bouncing off walls mechanic is just kind of awful. I think this should get a redesign. Maybe something like a heat-seeking missile, or like it turns around and then aims for a target, or maybe something else entirely. So I suggested, for example, something like penetrating shot can now be channeled, maybe for 1.5 seconds, and then for every 0.25 seconds you get like 100% damage multi. So you like charge it up and then release it, and it goes boom and everything explodes. So that's the kind of stuff I would like to see for pen shot. That would actually differentiate it quite a bit from other core ranged builds, and that could actually be cool, I think. Like, this is just like way too inconsistent, so sometimes it bounces like 5 times and does a lot of damage, and most of the time it just goes nowhere, basically. So that's kind of the problem here. Then you have the Ice in the Dark nerf. So effectively, Ice in the Dark is not an item you're gonna use anymore for Death Trap build, because this only happens every 10 seconds, including the damage buff and the rearm. So you're gonna spam like 3, 4, 5 death traps per second. So 1 in 50 is gonna be buffed. So that's actually useless. So you're just gonna run normal pants, or you run a Tybalt or something like that, but not this. The only reason to still run Ice in the Dark would be just for the Aftermath ranks. But if you don't go for 275 resource and trying to get the Banished Lord's Talisman every single cast because overpower is nerfed, then you're not even going to do that, and you're going to be totally fine with just 150 energy. You can reach that easily, and that's it, basically. Some interesting Paragon updates though. So some stuff that is really good. I think this is a very good change. This is actually like a really solid board, because basically everyone uses either Dash or Shadow Step, for example, or even like Concealment or Smoke, like a lot of skills. And it lasts 10 seconds, so this is like an easy pickup for many builds now. That's kind of cool. Pixel Trade got a really cool flavor here now as well, so it's not just like a 8 seconds buff, but it's slightly higher with 30% now, but you actually have to hit enemies first. So that might be a bit of a struggle in some cases, where you have to, like, for example, dash through a pack, or you have to Shadow Step the boss once or something like that. But most of the time I think this will be consistent enough to be a relatively good damage buff, but it's not really going to be such a good like speed farming options. And then you have the Eldritch Bounty change, which reads like a buff, but it could also be a nerf in some cases. For example, Word of Arcane, like Rain of Arrows builds, doesn't actually put like any of the imbuements on the bar, and now you can't benefit from Eldritch Bounty anymore. So that might be a bit of a struggle. Now we do have some alternatives now, so it might be okay. I didn't really look at the Paragon options here, but at least for these scenarios, there are some cases where this is actually a nerf. And lastly, we have the Sorks here. Again, a bunch of basic buffs. I don't really expect to see any basic build on the Sork. So in the very far past, we had like Arc Lash Sork, for example, but this is not coming back here. Firebolt, I guess, is a thing right now, but combustion builds, any kind of burn build is like down in the gutter right now, so I don't have hope here, and the others are not really good enough for anything. Lightning Spear reads like a big buff, but they murdered the aspect. And I did talk about this earlier, where I would like to see actually a bit of a mechanical change with like more damage but less arcing. I think that would make a lot of sense here to actually make the build feel good, especially when it comes to boss fights. But I guess this is what we got for now, so maybe there's still hope to see a change. Hydra is going to be quite interesting. It's like, I think, the only skill in the game that has neither a mana cost nor a cooldown, so just a free skill now. Which also means that you probably can't actually stack something like Stardust Ring, and you have to use some other skill in order to stack the Stardust Ring, because now Hydra can become a core skill, and you kind of want to have that ring because it's a nice damage buff and so on. So it's going to be a bit weird, but I guess there's an option to do that. You just cast Hydra and then maybe cast something else, like Ice Shards with the Hail of World-Glass or something. So there might be some ways to do this, and Hydra does definitely have some potential here, so we'll see. A bunch of other relatively irrelevant buffs to the burning builds that will not make up for the nerfs. For example, here with Combustion, that is going way down. Veers is getting a bit of a side grade, so that's going to remain pretty solid key passive, I think. It also gives like damage reduction still, I think, plus like something of like a 75% or so damage buff on single target, which is kind of nice. Enlightenment, a pretty important little change in wording, but with a huge impact. So previously you got the total combined value of fire, lightning, and cold damage as one, and now you only get the highest of them. So you don't combine anymore, so that effectively immediately kills all of this weird like double dipping and crazy exponential scaling and bugging. There were a bunch of bugs here as well. So that is all gone with that change. for the most part at least. And then we have not really received like a mechanical update to the key passive itself. So some builds will be forced to run Enlightenment because no other key passive works for them. For example, like the existing Ice Shards, Azure Wrath build. Azure Wrath is not a frost skill. You can't use Avalanche, for example. And this means you have to go Enlightenment, and you have to play around with a clunky mechanic of getting sometimes this huge damage buff and sometimes nothing. I was hoping to see a change here where maybe this would be a bit of like a, an up and down like spectrum basically, and you can ramp it up and it decays or maybe something like that, and not this like whole like feast and famine playstyle. It's just not really fun. So I hope that maybe Blizzard is going to reconsider this and actually make this a little bit more consistent, because it just doesn't feel great even in the nerf state. Then you have a bunch of aspect changes here. So Hydra stuff, this is going to be pretty big. So again, this will help with like the whole Hydra combo. Then we also have this here. This also helps the Hydra. This is also a Hydra buff, but we'll see if we can actually run that aspect. But 10 ranks is quite a lot of ranks, to be honest, so that could be nice. And the cool part about this is all these effects here are also relatively unconditional buffs. So you just need to cast your Hydra, regenerate the mana, and otherwise, there's no shenanigans like you need to stagger the balls, you need to freeze the enemy or so. There are still some little perks for that, from like the passives, for example. But it's not like, you need to have all these effects active. So it's going to be kind of nice, and it's going to feel smooth. Shivering aspect, this change is mostly just a wording change. And then here's Spindling Energy. So this is like the big nerf to the Lightning Spear here that I talked about. So that's going to go way down, like 90% or something like that, just on this alone. And that also pretty much sums it up. So there's a few more like details here, but this is mostly stuff that we have seen in Campfire, like drop buffs and, new Whisper caches or better Whisper caches and whatever. So there's a lot of little stuff here. So there are also good news in this patch. This is mostly like the balancing changes that I talked about here. But they are actually improving a lot of the existing systems and the way the grind works. I think it's going to be feeling a lot better to play. And it's going to feel a lot better to progress a character, and Torment 4 is actually going to be somewhat of like a target you want to reach now that actually matters. So both in how difficult it is to get there, and also in the rewards, because for example, they said that you now have higher chance to get greater affixes and multiple greater affixes on a gear, for example, when you go into the higher tournaments. So I think that is really good, because previously it just kind of felt like there was not really a reason to even try. If your build was really weak or you just didn't want to farm, you were totally fine just like staying in Torment 3. And now there's a bit of an incentive to actually go to Torment 4 to have a higher chance to get the good loot. You're going to get those like dopamine hits a bit more often. So I feel that might be the right direction here, and that might feel pretty good. But as I discussed, a lot of builds are going down. This means that going to Torment 4 will be not as easy. We will still have plenty of builds that will be able to do this and even take down the Torment 4 bosses without that much of a struggle. But yeah, especially like Torment 4 bosses is going to be reserved for very well geared characters or very good players. So this is what I expect here, and I think a lot of people will probably stay in like the Torment 3 bossing territory, and then Torment 4 like farming for the rest of the loot and the rest of the content. Also, we didn't really get any like overarching game updates that I was hoping for. So for example, Masterworking update, Tempering update, Pit updates, like all that stuff did not happen. So I'm a little bit disappointed in that, I gotta say. So while I think that we are kind of moving in a better spot now in terms of where the power of builds is landing and the progression, this makes a lot more sense now, I think, with like going through Torment 1 to Torment 2 to Torment 3 and so on. I think that whole journey is going to feel even better than it did in Season 8, where it was already much improved in my book. I do hope that we're going to see some bigger updates to some of the existing systems. So Night Management stuff looks kind of cool, but all the other stuff was untouched. And even small changes could have made a big impact here. In any case, that's what I got here for now. So don't really take this for gospel right now. I have not crunched the numbers on every single build. We have not played the PTR just yet, but I'll keep you guys covered when it goes live next Tuesday. So I'll be there, I'll be blasting. You can watch my live stream. I'll be posting video updates and so on. So stay tuned for that. Hope you enjoyed my thoughts here. Let me know what you think. Maybe I was off somewhere. Maybe I forgot something. So I'll see about that. Maybe I'm gonna cover it in some other video. So for now, this is what I got. Hope you like this, and see you guys next time.